Between 1970 and 1982, a secluded institution in central Pennsylvania developed a reputation for reforming troubled clergy through seclusion, reflection, and structured labor. Officially known as the Divine Light Mission, it operated with little external scrutiny. Publicly endorsed by several diocesan offices, it maintained the appearance of a serene retreat for ministerial correction. However, internal records show that 15 individuals registered as residing clergy quietly exited all documentation during that period. No departure logs, no reassignment papers, no funerals. For over a decade, silence filled the gaps where their names had been. To the public, the Divine Light Mission served a pragmatic and spiritual purpose, a temporary redirection center for priests and ministers facing non-criminal infractions or disciplinary questions. Located on over 600 acres of forested land, the compound promised confidentiality and rehabilitation away from the public eye. Visitors saw dormitories, prayer halls, and community gardens, all under the stewardship of a dedicated lay brotherhood. Reports submitted to the overseeing archdiocese consistently listed a stable population and orderly operations. Yet families of former residents received no follow-up once intake was completed. Despite increasing concern, few external authorities ever conducted a thorough review. Shall we begin with Chapter 1, Part 1? While the compound's physical design projected serenity, its internal administrative structure was distinctly hierarchical and methodical. The head of operations, listed on paperwork as Brother Conrad M., managed daily functions with the precision of a seasoned bureaucrat. Unlike ordained clergy, Brother Conrad was a lay administrator recruited in the mid-1960s from a diocesan accounting department. His background in finance and facility oversight made him an ideal candidate for managing what was increasingly being referred to as a special function campus in diocesan memoranda. He instituted a detailed intake protocol. Each new resident arrived after formal recommendation from an ecclesiastical review committee. Upon entry, ministers surrendered personal items for safekeeping and signed a voluntary residency form. The process was said to provide a clean break from external distractions. Most ministers arrived under temporary reassignment clauses, allowing church authorities to shield them from publicity or controversy while arranging long-term decisions. In theory, stays lasted between 3 months and 1 year. In practice, files rarely indicated exit dates with the same precision as arrivals. Official correspondence between the mission and regional dioceses framed these extended stays as necessary for deeper discernment. Monthly progress notes were often submitted without signatures, listing the residents' initials only. The language used remained vague. Responding well, continues under observation, or in rarer cases, pending further evaluation. Despite the ambiguity, the tone never indicated crisis. Publicly, no failures were acknowledged. The compound itself held to a routine that rarely changed. Residents awoke at 5:30 a.m. Morning meditation and community liturgy followed. After breakfast, residents were assigned to maintenance tasks, tending the greenhouses, repairing outbuildings, cataloging texts in the archive wing. These duties were labeled as restorative activities and tracked by the mission's wellness rotation chart. While some residents expressed quiet satisfaction with the rhythm, there were occasional requests for early release or external contact. These were typically reviewed by a small internal board composed of senior staff and a consulting ecclesiastical liaison. Approval was rare. A former kitchen assistant who worked on contract between 1974 and 1976 later recalled that while he interacted regularly with residents, he was instructed never to discuss origins or plans for departure. He noted the presence of a logbook at the service entrance, used exclusively by supply vendors and short-term contractors. The pages contained only dates and initials, no names, no reasons for entry. When the assistant asked about the turnover of certain residents, he was told that transfers were managed confidentially as a matter of pastoral discretion. This policy of pastoral discretion extended to the mission's telephone access. Residents were not permitted to make or receive calls without written permission. A locked switchboard, staffed by a rotating crew of administrative aides, controlled all outgoing communication. Visitors were discouraged except under exceptional circumstances, such as legal consultation or reassignment briefings. Letters, if allowed, were routed through the main office and photocopied into resident files before being sent or received. In 1977, a request from a Western diocese for the status of a former minister named Gerard M. was met with a polite deferral. The response stated that he was not presently available for correspondence due to extended immersion. When a second request was sent 8 months later, the mission replied that his file had been transferred to the Central Record Depository for reclassification. Internal records, when later reviewed, made no mention of Gerard M. after his listed intake date in 1974. The case of Gerard M. was not isolated. Throughout the 1970s, at least 5 other diocesan offices submitted similar requests concerning residents whose departure could not be confirmed. In each case, the mission responded with a variation of the same phrasing: extended immersion, ongoing discernment, or reassignment under review. Families who contacted the mission directly were redirected to the referring diocese. The circular nature of these responses created a procedural vacuum in which inquiries stalled without resolution. Among the staff, policies were maintained with uniform discipline. Performance evaluations praised Brother Conrad's stability under administrative pressure and his ability to manage sensitive transitions without disruption. The mission rarely hired from outside. Most roles were filled internally or drawn from a small network of vetted ecclesiastical support workers. A quiet code of confidentiality permeated every department. In 1980, a maintenance contractor tasked with upgrading the facility's water filtration system reported that several of the residence halls appeared underused. Despite a listed population of over 30 residents, he claimed to observe fewer than a dozen individuals during his 3-week project. When he mentioned the discrepancy to a facilities coordinator, he was told that some residents undergo silent retreat protocols, minimizing their public presence. The explanation was delivered politely, but without invitation for further questions. The silence surrounding population numbers extended into financial documentation. Annual budgets submitted to supporting dioceses detailed line items for utilities, food, and infrastructure maintenance. Yet records cross-referenced with supply invoices showed consistent overstocking. Food deliveries exceeded the requirements for the known population. Medical supplies were listed in bulk quantities. Invoices for psychological evaluations appeared sporadically, often processed under third-party consulting names rather than individuals. From an institutional perspective, the Divine Light mission appeared stable, even exemplary. The grounds were maintained with precision. Staff turnover remained low. Diocesan liaisons visiting for audits were given structured tours that emphasized spiritual growth and administrative clarity. Rooms were clean. Records, though incomplete, were well organized. Nothing suggested immediate concern. However, in 1982, a regional audit committee reviewing multiple retreat and correctional centers noticed inconsistencies in annual census reports. Specifically, the Divine Light mission listed intake numbers that failed to match external reassignment records. 15 individuals had check-in documentation, but no verifiable record of departure, reassignment, or release. Internal memos show that when this discrepancy was raised with the mission, it replied with a request for clarification on jurisdictional boundaries, claiming that record-keeping was handled through a shared clerical system. No further explanation was offered. Despite the irregularities, the committee chose not to pursue a full investigation. One internal note cited lack of probable irregularity, and another stated that the mission's internal review processes had historically demonstrated trustworthiness. The file was a network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. Repetir. In 1983, a former seminarian named Louis Carwin submitted a formal complaint to the Regional Clergy Council citing prolonged difficulty in locating his assigned mentor, Father I.A. Hendley. Hendley had been his spiritual supervisor during training and had been placed at the Divine Light mission in 1978. Carwin's letters to the mission went unanswered. When he contacted the diocese, He received a brief note stating that Hendley's period of reflection had been extended indefinitely. The tone of the reply struck Carwin as overly formal. He described the response as precise but uncooperative in his filed complaint. It was the first external grievance directly referencing one of the 15 unresolved names. That same year, a librarian working within the Diocesan Records Office found that the file folder for another former resident, listed as Martin J.P., had been marked inactive without a date of reassignment. A notation on the folder's tab read, "Archived per discretion." Inside the folder were 3 intake documents, a psychological intake form, and a 2-sentence progress report. There was no documentation of release or transfer. When she raised the question during an internal meeting, she was advised that the records in question had likely been relocated during a filing consolidation. The matter was not raised again. Other small indications accumulated, though none prompted formal intervention. A utilities subcontractor noticed that a row of outdoor lights behind the administrative wing remained on during daytime hours for several consecutive weeks. He submitted a maintenance suggestion to the facility's front office and received a generic form thanking him for his input. A local postal coordinator, reviewing changes to delivery routes in the area, noted that correspondence volume from the mission had declined sharply in the span of 2 years. She included this observation in her monthly report, but did not flag it for further review. In late 1984, a state-level registrar processing educational credentials for clergy placements discovered that a batch of certifications issued by the mission lacked the necessary signatures from ecclesiastical authorities. Though the forms bore the correct formatting, the official seal impressions were shallow and misaligned. He attempted to verify the credentials with the diocesan office and received confirmation letters bearing identical phrasing and identical postmarks. The letters were filed without follow-up. Around this time, a quiet shift took place in how the mission described its function. Public brochures, once labeled pastoral reintegration, were replaced with new literature describing the campus as a discipline and discernment facility. The language avoided direct references to correctional measures, but emphasized extended vocational analysis. A newly printed chart showed an idealized pathway for reintegration into parish life, concluding with a recommendation stage that was described as unbound by deadlines. While these changes were approved by administrative oversight, the timing coincided with increased turnover in diocesan leadership. By 1985, over half of the original administrators who had supported the mission's founding had retired or been reassigned. Their replacements inherited files with long-established routines and pre-formatted reports. None had direct memory of the early intake lists. When one staff member, newly assigned to personnel reconciliation, attempted to update placement records, he found that several resident names from the 1970s were coded as withdrawn by request. No such requests could be located in the archive. When he inquired, a senior clerical aide responded that these cases were legacy files and did not require further action. The term legacy file began to appear with more frequency. It was used to describe any incomplete case without documentation of closure. Within the system, it served a bureaucratic purpose, allowing for the reclassification of unresolved records without declaring loss or abandonment. Under internal policies, such files were no longer considered active, and thus not subject to audit or review unless new information emerged. As no new information had officially surfaced, the files remained sealed. It was in this environment that Sister Alvina Horrell began compiling her private index. Assigned to the Archdiocesan office as part of her administrative novitiate, she worked primarily in personnel logistics. Over time, she noted a recurring absence of final documentation for several early mission residents. Each name she marked had a confirmed intake form and at least one status update, followed by an abrupt stop in activity. Her index grew to include 15 entries. Rather than raise the issue publicly, she began cross-referencing her list with regional parish logs. In every case, there was no record of reassignment or retirement announcement. Several of the names appeared once more in community bulletins following their initial placement at the mission, but after that, no further mention occurred. One former minister had been listed as a speaker at a retreat in 1975. The next recorded appearance in any church documentation was a brief note of withdrawal per diocesan reassignment protocol. The location of that reassignment was unspecified. By mid-1986, Sister Alvina shared her findings with a retired Monsignor known for his role in early clerical placement programs. He advised her to be cautious, noting that institutional memory often frayed over time. He added that her concern, while understandable, may not reflect wrongdoing, but rather outdated filing practices. She accepted his counsel, but kept the index active, updating it when she came across references to unlisted personnel files or unexplained gaps. The following year, the mission submitted a building permit request to the local zoning board for the expansion of its north annex. The proposal listed additional sleeping quarters, a new archival wing, and extended security fencing along the rear perimeter. While the permit was granted without objection, a zoning reviewer noted that the fencing plan covered areas not included in public tours of the facility. The reviewer asked whether the new fencing would affect access paths used by visiting clergy. The mission spokesperson assured him that all approved paths would remain open. The fencing was later installed without further comment. During a winter review in 1988, an archivist performing inventory at the diocesan A-network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. Repetir. During a winter review in 1988, an archivist performing inventory at the diocesan off-site facility discovered an internal memorandum referencing a program called Extended Covenant Tier 3. The memo, dated 1979, listed the Divine Light mission as the coordinating site and included 15 alphanumeric identifiers next to abbreviated names. Most identifiers matched entries from Sister Alvina Horrell's private index. The document lacked further explanation, offering only a summary line: Tier 3, not to be reconciled externally. The archivist logged the finding and placed a photocopy into the review bin marked Non-Essential Historical. The bin remained untouched for several months until it was incorporated into a broader review of outdated terminology in the archive's filing system. A new administrator flagged the phrase "not to be reconciled externally" and raised a clarification request with the legal liaison responsible for institutional records. The liaison replied that the phrase likely referred to internal disciplinary mechanisms and that any further interpretation would require permission from the originating office. As the originating office was listed as the now renamed Pastoral Operations Subcommittee, the request was archived. Meanwhile, minor inconsistencies continued to surface. A visiting clerical auditor observed that annual personnel summaries for the mission's first decade of operation referenced the same supervisor names for multiple years, even during years where diocesan bulletins reported those supervisors had transitioned to other roles. When asked for clarification, the mission replied that early forms had used placeholder names for ease of continuity. The explanation was accepted without verification. In 1989, the bishop overseeing the diocese announced an administrative reorganization. Several facilities, including the Divine Light mission, would be reclassified under the newly formed Department for Vocational Health. The change was largely semantic, but it prompted a formal cataloging of facility missions, history, and operational scope. Each location was asked to submit a 10-year overview. The document received from the Divine Light mission consisted of 6 pages, with 2 pages devoted to the facility's horticultural initiatives and internal liturgical practices. Staffing figures were presented in broad categories. The section labeled Residency Throughput used aggregated data and included a note: certain entries redacted to maintain confidential protocols from previous clerical oversight structures. By this point, the original intake documents for the missing 15 had been moved off-site for preservation. An internal attempt to digitize legacy entries was suspended when several files were marked with permissions requiring dual authorization. These restrictions had been enacted under a policy issued in 1978, designating certain personnel records as Restricted Access, Compliance Level B. The policy lacked a clear definition for that classification, but staff were advised not to override access without written direction. It was during this archival stasis that a non-affiliated researcher named Walter Kinley began submitting formal inquiries. A graduate student focusing on administrative infrastructure in religious institutions, Kinley had encountered references to the Divine Light Mission while compiling his thesis on mid-century clerical rehabilitation programs. Noting the unusual frequency of unlisted departures and procedural vagueness in mission documents, he requested access to annual census summaries and reassignment ledgers. His request was denied, citing privacy concerns. Kinley then filed a records petition with the state's non-profit registry board, which maintained oversight of educational facilities operating under tax-exempt religious status. The board responded that the mission's classification exempted it from most disclosure requirements due to its internal role in vocational discernment. However, the correspondence did prompt an internal clarification memo from the board's records liaison, requesting that any future classification disputes be routed through the Director of Compliance. This created an audit trail indicating that the mission had received at least one formal external inquiry regarding historical accountability. Shortly afterward, Kinley contacted Sister Alvina through a mutual acquaintance. After reviewing his findings and comparing them with her own index, she confirmed overlap in 15 names and 2 date ranges. They noted that while many institutions experienced loss of documentation over time, the mission's omissions followed a consistent pattern. Each missing file involved intake confirmation, 1 or 2 status updates, and then a complete halt in documentation. No file transitioned through the expected stages of reintegration, transfer, or clerical retirement. They agreed not to publicize the index, given the sensitivity of ecclesiastical records. Instead, Kinley proposed submitting an academic query to a historical journal specializing in institutional continuity. The submission, framed as a review of record-keeping protocols, outlined the procedural opacity found in certain facilities. Though it avoided naming the Divine Light Mission directly, footnotes referenced publications and architectural layouts traceable to it. The article was accepted in 1990 and prompted a limited but notable response from archivists and administrative scholars. Several submitted letters to the journal noting the rarity of institutions maintaining extended residency without full personnel flow documentation. A former assistant director of a neighboring clerical retreat wrote that while confidentiality was routine, permanent omissions were considered irregular. Privately, Kinley continued to press for more documentation. He submitted a formal appeal to the Regional Clergy Ethics Board requesting clarification on the classification term extended covenant. The board replied that the phrase had no present definition under current policy. When Kinley provided the 1979 memo as reference, the board stated that it fell outside their scope of review. The communication concluded with a reiteration that internal records remain the jurisdiction of the facility unless compelled by extraordinary oversight. By 1991, Sister A network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. Repetir. In the spring of 1991, a low-priority inventory reconciliation took place within the Diocesan Property Ledger Division. The task, initially triggered by insurance indexing, involved verifying the square footage and usage classification of every site owned or managed by ecclesiastical offices across 5 counties. The Divine Light Mission, included due to its archival designation and semi-active residency status, submitted its facility footprint along with auxiliary structure records. Among the listings was an unregistered outbuilding referred to as Unit S. The structure had not appeared in any previous zoning applications, insurance claims, or internal facility layouts. When the oversight liaison contacted the mission for clarification, the response was concise. Unit S was an emergency storage site constructed under pastoral approval during the 1970s and retained for non-essential overflow. The explanation did not resolve the classification discrepancy, as non-essential structures were still subject to registration under archdiocesan policy. The issue was forwarded to a property compliance subcommittee, which requested a visual confirmation and architectural summary. The mission replied 2 weeks later with a dated blueprint fragment showing a rectangular structure near the tree line west of the horticulture greenhouse. No foundation details or usage history were included. A notation on the margin read, "Approved temporary structure, not for public access." The subcommittee accepted the submission, but attached a notation requesting photographic verification at the next routine inspection. That inspection occurred later the same year. Conducted by 2 lay property auditors, the visit included a guided walk of the campus's perimeter facilities. Upon requesting access to the area near Unit S, the auditors were advised that the structure had recently sustained weather damage and was not safe to enter. One of the auditors noted that while the building's external walls appeared intact, the path leading to the entrance was overgrown, with no recent signs of use. They logged this detail in their report, noting, "Structure visually present. Entry restricted due to sited instability. Verification pending." The note was filed without action. Under updated classification guidelines, non-primary use buildings did not trigger follow-up unless they housed active operational equipment or presented environmental hazards. Neither applied to Unit S under its listed designation. In 1992, Walter Kinley was granted temporary access to the diocesan planning records during an archival exhibit at a university library. While reviewing unrelated entries, he came across a planning map labeled with color-coded zones corresponding to various facilities across the region. On the map, the Divine Light Mission was marked with 3 operational sectors. A small square labeled S appeared in a zone noted for retired units and deferred renovation. This prompted him to revisit the facility's earlier construction filings. The absence of any documentation for the structure led him to request records from the county tax assessor's office. They confirmed that no permit had ever been filed for the building. Kinley compiled his findings into a written inquiry and submitted it to the Department for Vocational Health, under the pretext of verifying compliance for historical research. The inquiry was acknowledged, but no further communication followed. 6 months later, the department's public-facing documentation was revised. The Divine Light Mission's profile was updated to state that all current structures conform to past zoning conditions and are periodically reviewed under facilities maintenance discretion. The language was new, added without context. That same year, a separate event prompted increased scrutiny. A state-level committee on clerical infrastructure began reviewing insurance risk exposures tied to aging properties. As part of that review, a survey was circulated requesting confirmation of resident populations, occupancy turnover, and maintenance logs. Most institutions returned the form within 4 weeks. The Divine Light Mission delayed its submission, citing the absence of its facilities coordinator due to medical leave. When the form was finally submitted, it included updated figures that raised questions. The report listed 6 active residents and 8 inactive designations, defined in a footnote as non-participatory residencies under administrative discretion. This terminology had not appeared in any previous communication. The committee contacted the mission for clarification. They received a response explaining that the term referred to residents whose files had been transferred to archival status, but who were still counted for internal continuity. The explanation did not clarify whether these individuals were physically present. This led to a follow-up letter requesting definitions of archival status and an accounting of any structural limitations affecting access to inactive resident quarters. The mission responded that certain areas were closed off for long-term repairs and that inactive designations did not necessitate physical presence. The response was accepted, but logged with an internal note. Unclear framework. Requires revisitation upon policy review. During the following winter, administrative personnel at the Diocesan Records Management Center discovered a metal filing cabinet labeled DLM T3. The cabinet had no key and no digital inventory number. It had likely remained in storage since the late 1980s and was part of a group of unlabeled cabinets awaiting disposition. When opened during a scheduled cleanup, it contained 32 file folders, 15 of which were labeled with names previously listed in Sister Alvina's index. Each folder contained minimal documentation an intake sheet, a single summary report, and an unsigned transfer notice. The notices bore identical language. Transitioned to Tier 3 status. No external confirmation required. The cabinet contents were reviewed by a junior archivist who flagged the transfer notices due to their uniformity. The archivist submitted a preservation request, tagging the files for scanning and cataloging. However, within 2 weeks, the cabinet was reassigned to Legacy Classification, Confidential, and its contents were resealed under an administrative order citing pending re-evaluation. The archivist was informed that no further action was required. In early 1993, a diocesan technology consultant tasked with digitizing personnel directories encountered formatting inconsistencies in the Divine Light Mission's entries. Several clergy listed under early directories had no accompanying end dates or retirement status. A built-in reconciliation function flagged these omissions and attempted to autofill missing data by referencing nearby entries. The result was an automated listing that falsely marked several of the missing residents as status completed. When this error was identified, the mission instructed the consultant to suppress autofill functions for legacy records and to use manual verification only. The consultant made a private copy of the autofill logs. In a personal note, he wrote that the anomalies suggested a gap not in data entry, but in closure documentation. He shared this observation with a former instructor in clerical administration, who encouraged him to submit it as part of a training module on procedural completeness. The module, submitted anonymously, used redacted examples, but was archived under educational resources for future diocesan. A network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. Repetir later that year, a reassignment directive issued by the Department for Vocational Health inadvertently referenced a cleric believed to be deceased. The directive, distributed through a batch transmission to multiple diocesan offices, included a note assigning consultative duties to Father R.C. Mealy. His name had last appeared in diocesan correspondence in 1976, when he was admitted to the Divine Light Mission for vocational discernment. No exit documentation had ever been recorded. The administrative assistant who received the directive submitted a return query, assuming a typographical error. In response, she was provided with a follow-up listing Mealy's location as Tier 3 holdover, retained for advisory protocol. The designation had not previously been used in regional clerical assignments. When clarification was requested again, the return message advised the office to route all future correspondence through pastoral records, citing confidentiality standards. This sequence triggered internal discussion among placement clerks. One noted that at least 2 other clerics from her archived records had been listed in past directories, but never reassigned nor marked inactive. A quiet pattern emerged. A small number of residents entered the mission, received an initial update, then ceased to appear in any reassignment ledger or withdrawal form. A few had been presumed retired or relocated, but no formal entry confirmed it. Meanwhile, the structure labeled Unit S remained listed on facility maps, but never documented through updated inspection logs. An administrative intern assigned to compile an internal reference binder noted that photographs of all current use buildings were present except for Unit S. When she submitted a request for an updated exterior photo, she was informed that the structure was no longer functionally active and thus excluded from public representation. She marked the page incomplete. A later digital version of the binder omitted the Unit S entry entirely. In 1994, an internal memorandum within the Department for Vocational Health proposed a procedural review of all Tier 3 legacy holdings. The language of the memo framed the review as a routine inventory reconciliation. It suggested that legacy status records be assessed for administrative closure or reclassification. The proposal was reviewed but not approved. A notation in the margin of the rejection form read, "Existing classifications tied to historic compliance, revisit only upon formal directive." That directive never came. Instead, an administrative amendment redefined Tier 3 holdings as heritage deferred status, moving the files into a restricted segment of the diocesan personnel archive. The term allowed the institution to reference past internal categories without initiating a records audit. Staff training materials were updated accordingly. Under the new language, no previously archived file was required to be reopened unless a legal claim or canonical review demanded it. Neither occurred. During a seminary residency rotation that same year, a theology graduate named Nathan LaRue accessed archival material for research on clerical career transitions. While reviewing indexes, he located a reference code that corresponded to one of the previously identified 15 names. When he attempted to retrieve the file, he was told it was unavailable due to reclassification. After explaining the academic nature of his request, he received a summary sheet containing only intake and program start date. The summary included no conclusion. LaRue noted the omission in his research log. A professor reviewing his thesis draft marked the entry with a cautionary comment: "Institutional data may reflect policy, not outcome. Avoid inferring absence as anomaly." The warning, while academically standard, encapsulated the persistent challenge faced by those attempting to reconcile incomplete documentation. That same season, a technical analyst performing a network migration discovered a folder within the diocesan intranet labeled DLM-T3B. The folder contained scanned administrative reports from the early 1980s and a batch of internal correspondence tagged with the phrase "external freeze." The reports described personnel lists using codes rather than names. Several included progress ratings marked as pending for durations exceeding 5 years. After reviewing the folder's metadata, the analyst submitted a data retention request. He was advised that the folder fell under a legacy protocol and was being transitioned to cold storage. Within 72 hours, the folder was removed from the accessible archive and relabeled under an encrypted directory. The analyst received a follow-up message indicating that no further review was necessary. The message included a line citing compliance standards under the 1987 Documentation Restructuring Agreement. The name of the agreement did not appear in the institution's published policies. By the end of 1994, staffing changes at the mission led to the appointment of a new facilities coordinator. In his first month, he conducted a facilities usage review. Notes from the internal walkthrough included a reference to isolated housing unit requiring grounds assessment. Though not named directly, the dimensions and location in his description matched Unit S. The coordinator submitted a request for maintenance history and structural integrity reports. The request was marked deferred and returned with a notation: refer to 1979 approval file. No current intervention necessary. When the coordinator inquired about the location of the 1979 file, he was informed that it had been moved to microfilm storage and was no longer available on premises. He requested a summary of the approval rationale. The administrative reply referenced non-operational archival containment. No further action was documented. In 1995, a joint seminar on vocational placement standards was hosted by the regional archdiocese. During one of the sessions, a panelist from a neighboring state remarked on historical inconsistencies in residency transition records. While not referring to the Divine Light Mission directly, the panelist cited cases in which long-term placements concluded without closure documentation. The statement was met with brief discussion before the session moved on to broader policy implementation. In a closed-door meeting afterward, one attendee raised the issue with a senior moderator. The moderator acknowledged the irregularities, but attributed them to transitional record gaps common before digital archiving. When asked if any investigation had been conducted, the moderator stated that administrative memory in such cases was often fragmented, and that reopening files without compelling cause could introduce unnecessary strain on pastoral systems. The matter was not mentioned again. In the subsequent months, the Divine Light Mission discontinued all public-facing literature. Its final printed pamphlet was withdrawn from distribution, and its description in the diocesan directory was reduced to a single sentence: Restricted Residency Center operating under heritage designation. By early 1996, nearly all known references to the 15 individuals on Sister Alvina's original index had been removed from searchable databases. Where names once appeared in parish directories or staff bulletins, they were replaced by blank entries or general placeholder codes. Internal systems flagged them as resolved under compliance legacy, a term adopted following a restructuring of personnel protocols. No requests for follow-up were approved. In 1996, the diocesan personnel database underwent a software migration requiring manual cross-verification of all active and archival clerical profiles. During the process, entries previously categorized under legacy classifications were moved to provisional status pending confirmation. This recoding triggered automated alerts for any individual listed without a retirement date, reassignment location, or canonical release. Of the names flagged, 15 were redirected to a restricted access folder labeled Tier 3 Hold Archive. The folder included no update fields, only scanned intake forms, each bearing a notation, "Do not edit, source closed." The Digital Systems Coordinator, contracted externally for the migration, logged the anomaly as part of his final report. In his summary, he suggested that unresolved entries be reviewed by human resources or clerical placement specialists to confirm eligibility for archival sealing. No follow-up was recorded. The system retained the files in a static state. Around the same time, a clerical census report, prepared for a regional governance summit, excluded the Divine Light Mission from all active residency listings. A footnote at the bottom of the report identified it as a historical clergy wellness site now under quiet status. The term quiet status had not appeared in previous records. When asked to clarify, a spokesperson for the Department for Vocational Health replied that it indicated non-public operational continuity and referred to institutions fulfilling functions not covered under parish obligations. While most summit attendees accepted the explanation, one auditor from a southern district noted the phrasing's ambiguity. She submitted a request to review past census data for comparison. The request was acknowledged but delayed indefinitely due to system reorganization. The phrase remained undefined in all subsequent documentation. In 1997, the Diocesan Planning Committee drafted a facilities overview designed to assist in forecasting property usage over the next 20 years. Among the entries was the Divine Light Mission, identified as functionally minimal, with an expected phase-out date marked pending. When the draft reached the facilities liaison for confirmation, a correction was submitted. The phase-out date was removed, and the entry was updated to state, "Retains ceremonial compliance functions as needed." This revision prompted brief internal discussion. One committee member asked whether compliance functions required on-site staffing. The response noted that ceremonial designation did not necessitate population. It was a title used to preserve legal and ecclesiastical status for locations with historical integration into clerical systems. The designation allowed continued recognition without operational scrutiny. At the same time, researchers working on a national study of clerical mobility patterns contacted the diocesan office for access to anonymous transition data. Their intent was to trace general trends in length of service, reassignments, and early withdrawal. Among their data requests was a list of all regional facilities that handled transitional residency. The Divine Light Mission appeared on the master list, but was flagged with an annotation, "Excluded by request." When the researchers asked for clarification, they were told the facility had opted out of inclusion due to non-standard data classification. With no legal mechanism to compel participation, the researchers moved on. Their published study omitted the mission entirely, listing the region as having only standard vocational reintegration sites. Privately, one of the researchers, a doctoral candidate in institutional studies, compiled a separate list of facilities with limited documentation. He identified the Divine Light Mission as one of 3 locations nationwide with extensive residency intake data, but no measurable output. He did not publish the list. Instead, he noted in his personal files that the site appears as procedural placeholder rather than active system component. Later that year, a personnel aide reviewing historical appointment announcements noted that several early residents of the mission were absent from canonical registries. When she attempted to input updated notes, the system returned an error message indicating the profiles were locked under archival protocols. Each profile displayed the same closure note: transitioned per Tier 3 provision. Do not reassign. The aide consulted with her supervisor, who advised her to mark the task complete and suppress future alerts. The supervisor added that the entries had been sealed as part of institutional preservation, a phrase used during earlier database integrations to refer to entries exempt from public or internal tracking. During an off-site conference held in 1998, a visiting administrator gave a presentation on clerical retention strategies. A slide in the presentation featured anonymized data indicating that a small number of priests had historically been retained under closed-loop programs without open reassignment. An attendee asked whether these programs still existed. The presenter responded that such programs had been discontinued or converted into heritage sites. No specific facilities were named. That same spring, a request was submitted to review the physical storage protocols at the Diocesan Records Annex. As part of the review, an inventory was made of sealed cabinets and microfilm bins not scheduled for digitization. One cabinet, marked DLM Class B Legacy, contained a logbook with 15 entries. Each entry began with a name, a date of arrival, and a 2-line assessment. All 15 assessments ended with the same phrase: status recorded, further input not required. The inventory staff included the cabinet in the general audit, but received an instruction to exempt all entries labeled Legacy Tier. When asked who had issued the instruction, they were told it was a standing order tied to a prior classification agreement from the 1980s. No further clarification was given. The cabinet was resealed and refiled under permanent reference. Later that year, a revised internal training guide for vocational compliance staff introduced a new policy regarding historical entries. The guide instructed staff to use the designation administratively closed for any file transferred under prior sealing protocols. The definition included files moved due to procedural redundancy, consolidation of categories, or policy reinterpretation. The term did not distinguish between types of closure. By the end of 1998, nearly all mentions of the Divine Light mission in active operational documents had been replaced by placeholder codes. Its name remained listed on clerical maps as a restricted facility, but it no longer appeared in annual personnel summaries. While the physical location remained intact, the administrative footprint had receded into managed silence. Those who had once questioned the gaps found fewer avenues for follow-up. Policies had shifted, definitions had changed, permissions had been revoked or absorbed into broader clauses. What remained were sealed folders, disconnected profile entries, and structures whose official use could no longer be publicly described. The names listed by Sister Alvina Harrell were no longer flagged in system alerts. The codes associated with them had been reconciled under a framework that required no further visibility. The files were closed. The building was intact. The explanations, where offered, had become standard. In 1999, the regional clerical database underwent a secondary consolidation. The purpose was to align historical records with current indexing standards before the transition to a national archival schema. Institutions marked as legacy sites were reviewed for compliance. Most records passed through automatically. The Divine Light mission, listed under its facility code rather than name, triggered several duplicate entries flagged for missing endpoints. These entries did not include dates of reassignment, retirement, or withdrawal. Instead, they terminated with internal routing codes matching previously logged Tier 3 identifiers. A contracted data technician assigned to standardize the entries noted that none of the flagged cases corresponded to modern clerical identification numbers. When he attempted to trace the data trail, he encountered a locked access barrier designated for archival tier records. The error message instructed him to notify compliance, but his supervisor advised marking the entries archived manually, no adjustment necessary. The instruction was consistent with internal policy, but deviated from the national schema's reconciliation requirements. The discrepancies were noted in a side report appended to the migration logs. The report was stored locally and did not reach national index coordinators. Later that year, a newly appointed facilities coordinator visited the Divine Light mission to assess structural integrity for insurance re-evaluation. The site inspection followed routine guidelines. Photographs were taken of standing buildings, access roads, and boundary fences. Most structures showed signs of age but remained stable. At the northwest end of the property, the inspector noted a small detached unit with overgrowth along the entry path and boarded windows. It was identified as Unit S. The inspector asked whether the building was in use. The facilities representative stated that it had been designated as non-access since 1985 and retained for historical purposes only. When pressed about contents or condition, the representative deferred, stating the building was sealed per property preservation rules. The inspector logged the structure as restricted, preservation classification unverified. No further inquiry followed. The insurance evaluation concluded without incident, and the building remained unentered. Around this time, the Department for Vocational Health released an internal publication summarizing procedural revisions spanning the last 30 years. A section on legacy classifications referred to cases where administrative closure had been adopted without formal outcome notation. These entries, it stated, had been moved to non-revisitable status under archival compliance. The terminology indicated that even with updated systems, the original files would not be reopened or altered unless compelled by external review. The policy framework cited a document titled Clerical Continuity Assurance Agreement, 1982, although no digital version was available. When staff attempted to retrieve the file from physical archives, it was marked as preserved off-site with no transfer date. An annotation below read, Summary in use, source document not required. At the same time, the name of the Divine Light mission was formally removed from printed directories. Its location continued to appear on internal service maps, identified only by facility number and region code. This code matched the internal tag used for administrative legacy entries. No public acknowledgement was made of the removal. In a private correspondence filed later that year, a clerical archivist working on a vocational transition exhibit wrote to a colleague about unresolved entries from the 1970s. Without naming individuals, she described a pattern of intake documentation with no concluding phase. Her note stated, "We still encounter sealed profiles from that era. They begin like the others, then nothing. They just end." She did not pursue the matter further. Her note remained in an appendix of project communications and was later scanned into the general exhibit log. By 2000, external references to the Divine Light mission had diminished to the point of near invisibility. Occasional mentions appeared in oral histories or retirement interviews with clerics who had served in regional administration during the 1970s and 1980s. Their recollections often described the mission as a quiet site, distant from parish operations. Some referenced its isolation, others praised its order and routine. None mentioned conclusions. In 2001, the site was officially reclassified as an ecclesiastical historical property. The reclassification allowed it to remain on diocesan rolls without population or programming. The designation included a clause stating that files connected to the facility shall be maintained in accordance with pre-2000 sealing directives. Under this clause, no contents could be reprocessed without direct order from the Archivist General. The position was vacant at the time of designation. That vacancy was never formally filled. By 2003, the surrounding region had undergone zoning updates. New boundary maps placed the mission within a conservation overlay. The zoning board requested updated land use statements from all property holders. The statement submitted by diocesan representatives described the mission as inactive but maintained, with heritage status intact. No further land use details were provided. The statement was accepted. In 2004, an academic researcher compiling a digital timeline of vocational correctional institutions requested photographs or archival materials related to the Divine Light mission. The request was redirected twice before receiving a reply. The reply stated that no materials were available for public release and that the facility was no longer included in system history narratives. When the researcher asked why, The response noted record continuity exceptions. The researcher made no additional requests. By 2005, most administrative personnel with first-hand knowledge of the facility's early years had retired or passed their records to successors. Among incoming staff, references to the mission were infrequent and procedural. It existed in documentation only when required for asset reporting or archival code indexing. The sealed files remained stored under the same terms. The names of the 15 individuals were no longer queried. Their codes no longer triggered alerts. Their profiles no longer appeared in batch verifications. When reviewed by junior clerks or rotating archivists, the entries were described in brief. No conclusion provided, no adjustment allowed, no follow-up required. The system marked them complete. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story is fictional. All names have been edited to protect the source. This video is for entertainment purposes only. But here's a disclaimer. It's based on historical facts.